I can guarantee you that you do not know the historic origins of this concept that most people believe they have abolished, known as slavery. Chattel slavery they are talking about is one form of slavery. But little do they know, the history of slavery goes back to the foundations of all government. And so let us explore this untold, untaught human history. Looking into history, it is inevitable that you will find out that war, slavery, and government, and jailing systems alike, all correlate with one another so perfectly that to get rid of one is to get rid of the other. That you cannot have a government not based on violence, not based on war. It is not order, it is not peace, but rather, perhaps, the exact opposite. Have you ever heard of Etienne de la Boétie? Out of the 1500s, he said the fundamental political question is, why do people obey a government? He says the answer is that they tend to enslave themselves, to let themselves be governed by tyrants. Freedom from servitude comes not from violent action, but from the refusal to serve. Tyrants fall when the people withdraw their support. How many people simply change the laws or the people in power? And ask yourself, what does it mean to create that position by which you allow certain people to be the authority over your own life? Thomas Hodgkin, a philosopher, said these conquerors were the first legislators. By an almost interrupted succession, the power of legislation has continued in the hands of their descendants to the present day. If other conquerors have on some occasions overcome them, it has only been to succeed to their places. Almost all governments, Hume correctly observes, which exist at present, or of which there remains any record, have been founded originally on usurpation or conquest or both. The laws, says a writer in the Quarterly Review, in relation to the inferior classes of society, were throughout all European governments made by the strong against the weak, the natural consequence of government founded on oppression. The first materials, it is stated in the Edinburgh Review, of the laws of England were little more than the schemes of avarice and aggrandizement, or the ebullitions of revenge. The text, though written often upon sand, was written with the sword. The practice indeed afforded an evil commentary, but the law itself was the parent crime. In this law, founded on oppression, upheld by force and fraud, intended solely to preserve ill-gotten power or ill-gotten wealth, to maintain the dominion of the aristocracy and the supremacy of a priesthood, to perpetuate the slavery, ignorance, and poverty of the great body of the people, the political writers of our day call on all mankind to obey, as the only means of social salvation. Obedience to such law is the master folly of mankind, and this folly is inculcated with as much pernicity by those who have apparently no interest in making men fools and slaves, as if their own bread and their own breath hung on the doctrine. The great and important fact which it is necessary to promulgate far and wide then is that all European legislation was originally founded on oppression. But the oppressors and their descendants have never ceased to be in possession of the power of legislation. Seeing that conquerors have always been the legislators, and knowing that they have always endeavored to preserve their own power, I cannot avoid concluding that the law has always been made with a view to preserve as much as possible that appropriation of the soil, that artificial right of property, and that system of government. They were free themselves, but they reduced other men to slavery. Being the masters, they were of course the legislators. Their great object was, as far as that could be effected by legislation, to preserve their power over their slaves. And this just goes on and on talking about this. It's incredible. Wordsworth Donisthorpe, a philosopher from the 1800s as well, says, in the dawn of civilization, we find the bulk of the people in a state of absolute bondage, and even those who suppose themselves to be the independent classes subject to a most rigorous despotism. Mark Twain, another abolitionist from the 1800s, says, slaves to its priests, and through the priests to the king. It was the best friend a king could have, and the most dependable. They robbed the natives of their cattle under the pretext that all the cattle in the country belong to the king whom they have tricked and assassinated. They issue regulations requiring the incensed and harassed natives to work for the white settlers and neglect their own affairs to do it. This is slavery. He talks about the blunting effects of slavery upon the slaveholders. Moral perceptions are known and conceded the world over, and a privileged class, an aristocracy, is but a band of slaveholders under another name. He talks about party loyalty, he talks about conscience, and he talks about why slaves are so degraded and how they are actually proud that they are indeed a slave, which relates to mental slavery. Of course, Twain additionally details how mankind is the sole animal that robs, persecutes, oppresses, and kills members of his own tribe, the sole animal that steals and enslaves the members of any tribe. Clarence Lee Swartz from the 1800s says, from the simple effort of one individual to overcome and rob another, there soon developed the attempt of one clan, tribe, or group to conquer and subjugate another group, thus not merely taking the occasional accumulation of property of a person or persons, but also carrying off and enslaving the persons themselves. From that first primitive act of conquest and subjugation, that first act of governing as it is known today, came what we now call the state. And through all the ages, the state has retained the same old characteristic. It started in conquest, and that characteristic still dominates. It started by plundering, and that compulsory taxation continues to be one of its chief activities. Jean-Jacques Rousseau from the 1700s says the origin of society and law which bound new fetters on the poor and gave new powers to the rich, which irrevocably destroyed natural liberty, eternally fixed the law of property and inequality, converted clever usurpation into unalterable right, and for the advantage of few ambitious individuals subjected all mankind to perpetual labor, slavery, and wretchedness. I mean, how often do you see these words being spoken to you about some of these world-renowned philosophers, talking about how government at its core has been and always will be slavery? Henry Clarke Wright, an abolitionist, says men, as a government over men in the legitimate use of their governmental powers, have trampled under the foot the moral government of God. And then he gives a bunch of historical examples and says that all human governments have been invested with the war-making power. All human governments have considered war power essential. And he talks about how no government can exist without this domination of one or few individuals over many thousands or millions. He says human government has made the earth a slaughterhouse of the human race for 6,000 years. He says a bullet is in every ballot. He says without the war power, slavery could not exist. And he says their will is law, and to it all must yield or die. He says the great fault of this kingdom and of all governments is they govern the people to death. They throw obstacles in the way of the improvement of the people. To make criminals and then punish them is the real practical result of all governments, even those called most civilized. 9/10 of all the criminals of this kingdom are made so, more or less, by the influence of government. Let men think, speak, and act unregulated by the arm of violence and only guided by social sympathy, by mutual interest, and by justice, and wars would cease. It is as absurd and irrational to authorize a government to kill men, to prevent men from being enslaved, or to empower them to make war, to abolish slavery. And this speaks as to how governments cannot abolish slavery in the totality, since by its nature, we may say, government is founded upon slavery. C.F. Volney, a philosopher and abolitionist from the 1700s, talks about this even more. He says, from ignorance and cupidity, man has armed against man, family against family, tribe against tribe, and the earth has become a theater of blood, of discord, of rapine. This is just incredible quotes. You can just go on all day. He says they perfect the science of oppression in order to support a false equilibrium where the oppressors are less numerous than the oppressed. He says the art of governing became the art of subjecting the many to the few. In a written dialogue by Volney about the coming new age between people and civil governors and priests, the people challenge both groups, and among the conversation, the priests ask, "Would you live without gods or kings?" The people respond saying, "We would live without oppressors." The priests state, "You must have mediators, intercessors." The people respond saying, "Mediators with God and with the king, courtiers and priests, your services are too expensive. We will henceforth manage our own affairs." Both the priest and governor groups give up, saying, "We are lost. The multitude are enlightened." The people answer them saying, "You are safe. Since we are enlightened, we will commit no violence. We only claim our rights. We feel resentments, but we will forget them. We were slaves we might command, but we only wish to be free, and liberty is but justice." Volney states, "Every individual being absolute master of his own person, it follows that a full and free consent is a condition indispensable to all contracts and all engagements." He goes on to detail more scenarios of how governments view their people and view this idea of freedom and rebellion as sort of a virus that needs to be contained away from their true motives and agenda. But if the people do not stand in fear, they're able to stand universally in arms, he says. John Stuart Mill talks about this too. Was there ever any domination which did not appear natural to those who possessed it? There was a time when the division of mankind into two classes, a small one of masters and a numerous one of slaves, appeared, even to the most cultivated minds, to be a natural and the only natural condition of the human race. And he's talking about how people see how they're incapable of freedom. And he talks about how the theorists of absolute monarchy have always affirmed it to be the only natural form of government, and how this is basically the law of force, the grounds for the exercise of authority. He says, "For the governors are as much the slaves of their organization and discipline as the governed are of the governors." John Wesley, an abolitionist from the 1700s, also talked about this. The commander of the vessel sent to acquaint the king that he wanted a cargo of slaves. The king promised to furnish him, and in order to do it, set out designing to surprise some town and make all the people prisoners. Some time after, the king sent him word, had he not yet met with the desired success, having attempted to break up two towns, but having been twice repulsed. So giving basically detailed explanations about how slavery occurs. Wesley also details several examples of laws which actively backed the slave trade, or claims to tell slave masters what they can or cannot do. Wesley even mentions, if the most natural act of running away from intolerable tyranny deserves such relentless severity, what punishment have these lawmakers to expect hereafter on account of their own enormous offenses? And he also shares quotes from Judge Blackstone showing us how there cannot be a right to or a justification for slavery, sharing how slavery is based in the captivity of war, and that creates this system that we have. He says, "Liberty is the right of every human creature as soon as he breathes the vital air, and no human law can deprive him of that right which he derives from the law of nature." He says, "Let people live their lives by voluntary choice." Thomas Lydiard, a surveyor from the 1600s, also talked about this with his experience with Sir John Hawkins. So he goes deep into his experience. It's just incredible. The enormous cruelty is also described by individuals like Thomas Phillips and Sir Hans Sloane, and others, including John Wesley, are excluded here. But needless to say, the practice of slavery was horrifying and yet almost entirely unquestioned for thousands of years. You have Francis Dashwood Tandy from the 1800s who talked about this as well. Edward Carpenter, who said governments and laws are instituted with primary reference to its creation, protection, and enjoyment. It introduced human slavery as an instrument in its production. Thomas Paine of the American Independence even said this. Under how many subtitles or absurdities has the divine right to govern been imposed on the credulity of mankind? It is by distortedly exalting some men that others are distortedly debased, till the whole is out of nature. And he says it's a puppet show of state and aristocracy. To reason with governments as they have existed for ages is to argue with brutes. And John Gurney, quoting Garrett Winstanley, talks about this as well, and talking about the importance of the law of righteousness in our hearts and how people have been taught to accept outward teachers and rulers, and that people become the slaves to these different fictions, that man has been given dominion over all these different things within nature, but yet, is enslaved to himself and to his fellow man. There's also Gustave D. Molinari, who says the conqueror now became interested in protecting his sources of supply and began to devise systems for the better exploitation of territories and of the populations which were enslaved. These systems were the first political states. I mean, you can't get any more direct than that. Amos Bronson Alcott, an abolitionist, says we take too much notice of states and masses if we think them more mighty than individuals, but indeed we treat them as such. Wendell Phillips, an abolitionist, said government began in tyranny and force, began in feudalism of the soldier and bigotry of the priest, and the ideas of justice and humanity have been fighting their way like a thunderstorm against the organized selfishness of human nature. Every government is always growing corrupt. Auburn Herbert says every bloodstained ruler the right of making slaves their own desires. Frederick Bastiat, an author and philosopher, talks about this too, sharing Egypt, Persia, Greece, Rome, the spectacle of a few men molding mankind according to their whims, thanks to the prestige of force and of fraud. And that they did not understand the knowledge appears and grows with the passage of time, and that in proportion to this growth of knowledge, might takes the side of right, and society regains possession of itself, which gives us hope into the future, which is why we now recognize this divine right to rule is rather fallacious and not true. Lysander Spooner also detailed this problem, how all the great governments were founded upon this idea of divine right, the authority of God itself. And it may be worth noting that the word citizen is often used interchangeably with subject, which from the online etymology dictionary, the early 14th century subject means person under control or dominion of another, or submissive, compliant, obedient, related to subjugation or subjection, meaning servitude, bondage, captivity, inferior, subduing, and subordination. And there's many other terms for this, but it also means to make a person or nation subject to another by force. Joseph Dejecu, another abolitionist, said, if the sword of the soldier makes the multitude physical slaves, the catechism of the priest, a weapon far more dangerous, makes them moral slaves. So once you start adding in religion to politics, they become moral slaves. Mikhail Bakunin, a philosopher, talked about this too. He says, all states past and present has always preceded the idolization of this fact by some sort of religion and legislation, which is that brutal fact of brigandage, conquest, and slavery, the material and real base of all states. William Godwin says this too. War has hitherto been founded to be this inseparable ally of political institution. The earliest records of time are the annals of conquerors and heroes, and he lists a bunch of individuals as well. He says, if a prince sends forces into a nation where the people are poor and ignorant, he may lawfully put the half of them to death and make slaves of the rest in order to civilize and reduce them from their barbarous way of living. The feudal spirit still survives that reduced the great mass of mankind to the rank of slaves and cattle for the service of a few. So I just gave a bunch of historic examples, and now we're almost at 20 minutes. And if you're not clicking off by now, getting the point, I don't know how I can say it anymore. But the point is that why aren't historians, why aren't psychologists, why aren't modern day abolitionists addressing this problem of slavery in its real foundations, the government itself? Thank you very much for watching.
In the beginning of time, the great creator Reason made the earth to be a common treasury, to preserve beasts, birds, fishes, and man. The Lord that was to govern this creation. But not one word was spoken in the beginning that one branch of mankind should rule over another. working with covetousness, did set up one man to teach and rule over another. And man was brought into bondage and became a greater slave to such of his own kind than the beasts of the field were to him. And hereupon the earth, which was to be a common treasury of relief for all, both beasts and man, was hedged into enclosures by the rulers, and the others were made the servants and slaves. And that earth is bought and sold and kept in the hands of a few, whereby the great Creator is mightily dishonored, as if he were a respecter of persons, delighting in the comfortable livelihood of some and rejoicing in the miserable poverty of others. They have by subtle wit and power pretended to preserve a people in safety by the power of the sword, and by large pay, much free quarter, and other booties which they call their own. They get much monies, and with this they buy land and become landlords. And if once landlords, then they rise to be justices, rulers, and state governors. But all this is but a bloody and subtle thievery, countenanced by a law of covetousness, and a breach of the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. These landlords have thus stolen the earth from their fellow creatures that have an equal share with them by the law of reason and creation, as well as they. They are lifted up to be teachers, rulers, and lawmakers over them that lifted them up, as if the earth were made peculiarly for them, not for others. For what are all those binding and restraining laws that have been made from one age to another? What are they but the cords, bands, manacles, and yokes that the enslaved English, like Newgate prisoners, wears upon their hands and legs, by which those Norman oppressors and these their successors from age to age have enslaved the poor people.
Thank you for watching this part of the docu-series Slavery Gone for Good. Be sure to watch our other parts for a more deep understanding as to the nature of truth and action in its fullest extent. If you want to learn more and hear more quotes that have not been discussed in this video, be sure to buy the book Slavery Gone for Good Black Book Edition. This is the most important work in history, and you are part of that work. Do not forget it. As Frederick Douglass, former slave and abolitionist, said, "Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave."